Chapter 12. Jill heard something like breaking glass and held perfectly still, listening. The acoustics of the mansion were strange, the long corridors and unusual floor plan making it hard to tell where sounds were coming from. Or if you even heard them at all. She sighed, taking a last look around the quiet, book-lined sitting room at the top of the stairs. She had already checked the 3 other rooms along the gallery railing and found exactly nothing of interest. A sparse bedroom with 2 bunks, an office, an unfurnished den with a locked door and a fireplace inside. The only switches she had found were light switches, though she had gotten excited over a rather sinister-looking black button on the wall of the office, until she pushed it, and found that she'd managed to discover the drainage control for an empty fish tank at the corner. She'd found some ammo for the Remington, and she supposed she should be grateful for that. A dozen shells in a metal box underneath one of the bunks in the bedroom. But if there'd been any hidden crests, she'd missed them. Jill took out Trent's computer and checked the map, finding her position at the top of the stairs. Just past the sitting room's second door was a wide U-shaped corridor that angled back around to the front hall balcony. The corridor also connected to 2 rooms, one a dead end and the other leading through several more. She put the computer away and drew her Beretta, taking a moment to clear her mind before stepping into the corridor. It wasn't easy. Between trying to figure out what had happened in the house to create monsters, and her concerns for and about her team, her thoughts were distinctly messy. Should have looked closer at those papers. The office had been simple, a desk, a bookshelf, but there was a rack of lab coats by the door, and the papers strewn across the desk had been mostly lists of numbers and letters. She knew just enough chemistry to know that she was looking at chemistry, so she didn't bother trying to read them. But since finding the papers, she had begun to think of the zombies as the result of a research accident. The mansion was too well maintained to have come from private money, and the fact that it had been kept a secret for so long suggested a cover-up. She guessed that there was a couple of months' worth of dust on almost everything, which coincided with the first attacks in Raccoon. The people in the house had been conducting some kind of an experiment and something had gone wrong. Something that transformed them into flesh-eating ghouls? That's a bit far-fetched. But it made more sense than anything else she could come up with, although she'd kept her mind open to other possibilities. As to her concerns about the team, Barry was acting weird and Chris and Wesker were still missing. No new developments there.
And there won't be any if you don't get going.
Right. Jill put her musings on hold and stepped out into the hall. She noticed the smell before she actually saw the zombie farther down the corridor, crumpled to the floor. The small wall sconces cast an uneven glow over the body, reflecting off of dark red trim and tinting everything in the corridor a smoky crimson. She trained her weapon on the still body, and heard a door closing somewhere nearby.
Barry?
He'd said he was going to be in the mansion's other wing, but maybe he'd found something and had come looking for her. Or maybe she was finally going to meet up with someone else from the team. Smiling at the thought, she hurried down the gloomy hall, eager to see another familiar face. As she neared the corner, a fresh wave of decay washed over her, and the fallen creature at her feet grabbed at her boot, clutching her ankle with surprising strength. Startled, Jill flailed her arms to keep her balance, crying out in disgust as the slobbering zombie inched its rotting face towards her boot. Its peeling, skeletal fingers scrabbled weakly at the thick leather, seeking a firmer grip, and Jill instinctively brought her other boot down on the back of its head, the heavy tread sliding across the skull with a sickening wet sound. A wide piece of flaking scalp torn away, revealing glistening bone. The creature kept clawing at her, oblivious to pain. The second and third kicks hit the back of its neck, and on the fourth, she felt as much as heard the dull snap of vertebrae giving out, crushed beneath her heel. The pale hands fluttered, and with a choking, liquid sigh, the zombie settled to the musty carpet. Jill stepped over the limp body and ran around the corner, swallowing back bile. She was convinced that the pitiful creatures roaming the halls were victims somehow, just as much as Becky and Pris had been, and releasing them to death was a kindness. But they were also a menace, not to mention morbidly unwholesome. She had to be more cautious. There was a door to her right, heavy wood overlaid with twining metal designs. There was a picture of armor over the key plate, but like the other doors she'd come across upstairs, it was unlocked. There was no one inside the well-lit room, but she hesitated, suddenly reluctant to continue her search for whoever was wandering the area. 2 walls of the large chamber were lined with full suits of armor, 8 to a side, and there was a small display case at the back, not to mention a red switch set into the middle of the gray tiled floor.
Another trap? Or a puzzle?
Intrigued, she walked into the room and headed for the glass-fronted display, the silent, lifeless guard seeming to watch her every move. There were a couple of mysterious grated holes in the floor, one on either side of the red switch, for ventilation perhaps. She felt her heart speed up a little, suddenly sure that she had found another of the mansion's traps. A quick inspection of the dusty display case decided it for her. There wasn't any way that she could see to open it, the glass front a single thick piece. And something in one shadowy niche at the bottom glinted like dull copper.
I'm supposed to push that button, thinking that it will open the case. And then what?
She had a sudden vivid image of the ventilation hole sealing off and the door locking itself, a death by slow suffocation in an airless tomb. The chamber could fill with water, or some kind of poisonous gas. She looked around the room, frowning, wondering if she should try to block the door open, or if perhaps there was another switch hidden in one of the empty suits.
Every riddle has more than one answer, Jilly. Don't forget it.
Jill grinned suddenly. Why push the button at all? She crouched down next to the case and took a firm grip on the barrel of her handgun. With a single firm tap, the glass cracked, the line splintering away from the impact. She used the butt of her gun to knock out a thick chunk and reached carefully inside. She withdrew a hexagonal copper crest engraved with an archaic, smiling sun. She smiled back at it, pleased with her solution. Apparently, some of the house's tricks could be worked around, provided she ignored a few rules of fair play. All the same, she found herself hurrying back to the door, not wanting to call it a win until she was clear of the solemn chamber. Stepping back into the blood-hued corridor, she stood for a moment, holding the crest as she weighed her options. She could continue to look for whoever had closed that door, or head back to the puzzle lock and place the crest. As much as she wanted to find her team, Barry had been right about needing to get out of the mansion. If any of the other stars were still alive, they'd surely also be looking for an escape. Her thoughtful gaze fell across the fetid, broken creature that she'd killed, lingering on the slowly spreading pool of dark fluid surrounding its scabby head. And she realized suddenly that she desperately wanted to leave the house, to escape its tainted air and the pestilent creatures that stalked its cold and dusty halls. She wanted out, and as soon as was humanly possible. Her decision made, Jill hurried back the way she'd come, gripping the heavy crest tightly. She'd already uncovered 2 of the pieces that the stars needed to escape the mansion. She didn't know what they'd be escaping to, but anything had to be better than what they would leave behind. Richard! Rebecca immediately dropped to her knees next to the Bravo, feeling his throat for a pulse with one trembling hand. Chris stared mutely down at the torn body, already knowing that she wouldn't find a heartbeat. The gaping wound on Richard Aiken's right shoulder was drying, no fresh blood seeping through the mutilated tissue. He was dead. He watched Rebecca's slender hand slowly drop away from the Bravo's neck, and then reach up to close his glazed, unseeing eyes. Her shoulders slumped. Chris felt sick over their discovery. The communications expert had been a positive, sweet guy, and only 23 years old. He looked around the silent room, searching randomly for some clue as to how Richard had died. The room they'd entered just off the second-floor balcony was undecorated and empty. Except for Richard, there was nothing. Frowning, Chris took a few steps towards the room's second entrance and crouched down, brushing at the dark tile floor. There was a dried crust of blood in the shape of a boot heel between Richard's body and the plain wooden door 10 feet away. He stared at the door thoughtfully, tightening his hold on the Beretta.
Whatever killed him is on the other side. Maybe waiting for more victims.
Chris, take a look at this. Rebecca was still kneeling by Richard, her gaze fixed on the bloody mass of his torn shoulder. Chris joined her, not sure what he was supposed to be looking at. The wound was ragged and messy, the flesh discolored by trauma. Strange, though, how it didn't seem very deep.
See those purple lines radiating out from the cuts? And the way the muzzle has been punctured, here and here?
She pointed out 2 dark holes about 6 inches apart, each surrounded by skin that had turned an infected-looking red. Rebecca sat back on her heels, looking up at him.
I think he was poisoned. It looks like a snake bite.
Chris stared at her. What snake gets that big? She shook her head, standing.
Got me. Maybe it was something else. But that wound shouldn't have killed him. It would have taken hours for him to bleed out. I'm pretty sure he was poisoned.
Chris regarded her with a new respect. She had a good eye for details and was handling herself remarkably well, considering. He searched Richard's body quickly, coming up with another full clip and a shortwave radio. He handed both to Rebecca, tucking Richard's empty Beretta into his waistband. He looked at the door again, then back at Rebecca. Whatever killed him might be back there.
Then we'll have to be careful.
Without another word, she walked to the door and stood there, waiting for him. I've got to stop thinking of her as a kid. She's outlived most of the rest of her team already. She doesn't need me to patronize her or tell her to wait behind. He stepped up to the door and nodded at her. She turned the knob and pushed it open, both of them raising their weapons as they edged into a narrow hallway. Straight ahead were a few wood steps leading to a closed door. To their left, an offshoot of the hall, another door at the end. There was blood smeared on the walls bordering the steps. Chris was suddenly certain that it was Richard's. His killer was behind that door. He motioned down the offshoot, speaking quietly. You take that room. You run into any trouble, come back here and wait. Check back in 5 minutes either way. Rebecca nodded and moved down the narrow hall. Chris waited until she'd gone into the room before climbing the steps, his heart already thudding solidly against his ribs. The door was locked, but Chris saw that there was a tiny shield etched next to the keyhole. Rebecca was turning out to be more useful than he could have possibly imagined. He took out the key she'd given him and unlocked the wide door, checking his Beretta before moving inside. It was a large attic, as plain and unassuming as the rest of the mansion was ornate. Wooden support beams extended from the floor to the sloping ceiling, and other than a few boxes and barrels against the walls, it was empty. Chris walked further in, his guard up as he scanned for movement. At the other side of the long room was a partial wall, maybe 4 feet by 9, standing several feet from the back of the attic. It reminded him of a horse stall, and was the only area that wasn't open to view. Chris moved towards it slowly, his boots against the wood floor sending hollow echoes through the cool air. He edged to the wall, training his Beretta over the top as he peered down, heart pounding. No snake, but there was a jagged hole near the floorboards between the 2 walls, foot high and a couple across, and a strange, acrid odor, musky, like the smell of some wild animal. Frowning at the scent, Chris started to back away, and stopped, leaning in closer. There was a rounded piece of metal next to the hole, like a penny the size of a small fist. There was something engraved on it, a crescent shape. Chris walked around the side and into the stall, keeping a wary eye on the hole as he crouched down and picked up the metal piece. It was a 6-sided disc of copper with a moon on it. Nice bit of craftsmanship. Inside the hole, soft, sliding sound. Chris jumped back, targeting the opening as he moved. He backed up quickly until his shoulders brushed the attic wall, then started to edge away, and a dark cylinder shot out of the opening, lightning fast. It was as big around as a dinner plate, and it hit the wall inches from his right leg, wood crunching from the impact. Oh shit, that's a snake! Chris stumbled away as the giant reptile reared up, pulling more of its long, dusky body out of the wall. Hissing, it raised up, lifting its head as high as Chris's chest, and exposing dripping fangs. Chris ran halfway across the room and spun, firing its massive diamond-shaped head. The snake let out a strange, hissing cry as a shot tore through one side of its gaping mouth, punching a hole through the tightly stretched skin. It dropped back to the floor and whipped itself towards him with a single waving push of its muscular body, at least 20 feet long. Chris fired again, and a chunk of scaly flesh erupted from the snake's back, dark blood spewing from the wound. With another roaring hiss, the animal reared up in front of him, its head only inches away from Chris's gun, blood gushing from the hole in its mouth. Eyes, get the eyes! Chris pulled the trigger and the snake fell across him, knocking him to the floor, his body thrashing wildly. The tail slammed into one of the thick support beams hard enough to crack it as Chris struggled to free his pinned arms, to at least hurt it worse before he died, and the cold, heavy body suddenly went limp, sagging bonelessly across the floor.
Chris!
Rebecca rushed into the room and stopped cold, staring at the monstrous reptile.
Whoa.
His boot found one of the wooden supports, and with a tremendous shove, Chris managed to wiggle out from beneath the thick body. Rebecca reached down to help him up, her eyes wide with awe. They stared down at the wound that had killed the creature, the black liquid hole where its right eye had been, obliterated by a 9mm slug.
Are you okay?
Chris nodded, a few bruised ribs maybe, but so what? He'd literally been inches from certain death, and all because he'd stopped to... He held up the copper crest, having to pry his clenched fingers from around the thick metal. He'd held onto it throughout the attack, without even realizing it. And looking at it now, he had a gut feeling that it was important somehow.
Maybe because you're almost snake food for picking it up.
Rebecca took it from him, tracing a finger over the engraved moon. You find anything? Rebecca shook her head.
Table, couple of shelves. What's this for, anyway?
Chris shrugged, looking back down at the bloody hole where the snake's shining eye had been. He shuddered involuntarily, thinking of what would have happened if he'd missed that final shot.
Maybe we'll figure it out somewhere along the way. Come on, let's get out of here.
Rebecca handed the crest back to him, and together they hurried out of the cold attic. As he closed the door behind him, Chris suddenly realized that although he'd never cared before, he now absolutely hated snakes. Barry walked heavily up the stairs in the main hall, the knot of dread in the pit of his stomach tightening with each step. He'd been through every room he could open in the East Wing and had come up empty-handed. The same horrible images played through his mind over and over as he trudged up the steps. Kathy and Moira and Pollyanne, terrified and suffering at the hands of strangers in their home. Kathy knew the combination to the gun safe in the basement. His chances of her making it down the stairs before someone could get in. Barry reached the first landing and took a deep, shaky breath. Kathy wouldn't even think to run for the weapons if she heard someone breaking through one of the windows or doors. Her first priority would be to get to the girls, to make sure they were okay.
If I don't turn up those crests soon, nothing will be okay.
He hadn't seen a phone or radio anywhere in the house. If Wesker couldn't get to that laboratory, how would he be able to contact the people at White Umbrella and call off the killers? Barry reached the door on the upper landing that led into the West Wing. His only hope was that either Jill or Wesker had managed to find the 3 missing pieces. He didn't know where Wesker was, although he had no doubts that the rat bastard would turn up soon enough. But Jill would probably still be searching upstairs. They could split up the rooms she hadn't checked and at least rule out the least likely areas. If they couldn't uncover any more of the crests, he'd have to go back through the East Wing and start ripping apart furniture. He opened the door that led into the red hallway, lost in thought, and very nearly ran into Chris Redfield and Rebecca Chambers as they stepped out of the doorway on his right. Chris's face lit up with a broad, beaming grin. Barry! The younger man stepped forward and embraced him roughly, then backed up, still grinning.
Jesus, it's good to see you. I was starting to think that me and Rebecca were the last ones alive. Where are Joe and Wesker?
Barry pasted a smile on as he fumbled for an acceptable answer, feeling almost sick with guilt. Lying to Jill hadn't been easy, but he'd known Chris for years.
Kathy and the girls, dead.
Jill and I came after you, but all the doors in that hall were locked. And when we got back to the lobby, the captain was gone. Since then, we've been looking for you two and trying to find a way out. Barry smiled more naturally.
It's good to see you two, both of you. At least that much is true. So, Wesker just disappeared?
Barry nodded, uncomfortable.
Yeah. And we found Ken. One of those ghouls got to him. I saw. Forrest and Richard are dead too.
Barry felt a wave of sadness and swallowed thickly, suddenly hating Wesker even more. The people Wesker had worked for had done this, and now they wanted to cover it all up, avoiding responsibility for their actions.
And like it or not, I'm helping them do it.
Barry took a deep breath and fixed an image of his wife and daughters in his mind's eye.
Jill found a back door. We think it could be a way out, except it's got this trick lock like a puzzle, and we have to get all the pieces together to open it. There are these 4 metal crests made of copper. Jill got one already, and we think the rest are hidden throughout the mansion.
He trailed off at Chris's sudden grin as Chris reached into his vest.
Something like this?
Barry stared up at the crest that Chris had produced, feeling his heart speed up.
Yeah, that's one of them. Where'd you find it?
Rebecca spoke up, smiling shyly.
He had to fight a big snake for it. A really big snake. I think it may have been affected by the accident, though a cross-genus virus, those are pretty rare.
Barry reached for the crest as casually as he could manage, frowning.
Accident?
Chris nodded.
We found some information that suggests there's some kind of secret research facility here on the estate. And something that they were working on got loose. A virus.
One that can apparently infect mammals and reptiles. Not just different species, different families.
It's certainly infected mine.
He let his frown deepen, feigning thoughtfulness as he struggled to come up with an excuse to get away. The captain wouldn't approach him unless he was alone, and he was desperate to get the copper piece into place, to prove that he was still on board, cooperating, and that he'd convinced the rest of the team to help him look. He could feel the seconds ticking away, the metal growing warm beneath his sweating fingers.
We need to get the feds in on this. A full investigation, military support, quarantine of the area.
Chris and Rebecca were both nodding, and again Barry felt nearly overwhelmed by guilt.
God, if only they weren't so trusting.
But to do that, we have to find all these crests. Jill might have turned up another one by now, maybe both of them. I can only pray. Do you know where she is?
Barry nodded, thinking fast.
I'm pretty sure, but this place is kind of a maze.
Why don't you wait in the main hall while I go get her? That way we can organize a search, do a more thorough job. He smiled, hoping it looked more convincing than it felt.
Though if we don't turn up soon, keep looking for more of those pieces.
The back door's at the end of the West Wing corridor's first floor. Chris just stared at him for a moment, and Barry could see the questions forming in his bright gaze. Questions that Barry wouldn't be able to answer. Why split up at all? What about finding the missing captain? How could he be certain that the back door was an escape?
Please, just do as I say. Okay, we'll wait. But if she's not where you think she is, come back and get us. We stand a better chance of making it through this place if we stick together.
Barry nodded, and before Chris could say anything more, he turned and jogged away down the dim hall. He'd seen the hesitation in Chris's eyes, heard the uncertainty in his voice, and with his final words, Barry had felt himself wanting desperately to warn his friends of Wesker's betrayal. Leaving was the only way to keep himself from saying something he might regret, something that might get his family killed. As soon as he heard the door back to the balcony close, he picked up speed, taking the corners at a full run. There was a dead zombie near the door that led to the stairs, and Barry leaped over it, the stench falling away as he ducked through the connecting passage. He took the back stairs 3 at a time as his conscience yammered mercilessly away at him, reminding him of his treachery.
You're a liar, Barry. Using your friends the way Wesker's using you, playing on their trust. You could have told them what was really going on. Let them help you put a stop to it.
Barry shook the thoughts away as he reached the door to the covered walk, slamming the heavy metal aside. He couldn't risk it. Wouldn't. What if Wesker had been nearby, had overheard? The captain had Barry's family to blackmail him with, but once Chris and the others knew the truth, what was to stop Wesker from just killing them? If he helped Wesker destroy the evidence, the stars wouldn't be able to prove anything. The captain could just let them all walk away. Barry reached the diagram next to the back door and stopped, staring. Relief flooded through him, cool and sweet. 3 of the 4 openings were filled, the sun, wind, and star crests in place. It was over.
He can get to the lab now, call off his people. He doesn't need us anymore. I can go back in, keep the team busy while he does whatever he has to do. The RPD will show eventually, and we can forget this ever happened.
He was so elated that he didn't register the muted footsteps on the stone path behind him. Didn't realize that he wasn't alone anymore until Wesker's smooth voice spoke up beside him.
Why don't you finish the puzzle, Mr. Burton?
Barry jumped, startled. He glared at Wesker, loathing the smug, bland face behind the sunglasses. Wesker smiled, nodding his head at the copper crest in Barry's hand.
Yeah. Right.
Barry slipped the final piece into place. There was a thick metallic sound from the inside of the door. Ka-chink! And Wesker walked past him, pushing the door open to reveal a small, well-used tool shed. Barry peered inside, saw the exit at the opposite wall. There was no diagram set next to it, no more crazy puzzles to figure out. Kathy and the girls were safe. With a low bow, Wesker motioned for Barry to step inside the shed, still smiling.
Time's short, Barry, and there's still a lot for us to do.
Barry stared at him, confused.
What do you mean? You can get to the lab now. Well, there's been a slight change of plans. See, it turns out that I need to find something else, and I have an idea of where it might be. But there are some dangers involved. And you've done such a good job so far. I want you to come along.
Wesker's smile transformed into a shark-like grin, a cold, pitiless reminder of what was at stake.
In fact, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to insist on it.
After a long, terrible moment, Barry nodded helplessly. Chapter 13. My dearest Alma. I sit here trying to think of where to begin, of how to explain in a few simple words all that's happened in my life since we last spoke. And already I fail. I hope this letter finds you well and whole, and that you will forgive the tangents in my pen. This isn't easy for me. Even as I write, I can feel the simplest of concepts slipping away, lost to feelings of despair and confusion. But I have to tell you what's in my heart before I can rest. Be patient, and accept that what I tell you is the truth. The entire story would take hours for me to tell you, and time is short, so accept these things as fact. Last month there was an accident in the lab, and the virus we were studying escaped. All my colleagues who were infected are dead or dying, and the nature of the disease is such that those still living here have lost their senses. The virus robs its victims of their humanity, forcing them in their sickness to seek out and destroy life. Even as I write these words, I can hear them, pressing against my locked door like mindless, hungry animals, crying out like lost souls. There aren't words true enough, deep enough to describe the sorrow and shame that I feel, knowing that I had a hand in their creation. I believe that they feel nothing now, no fear or pain, but that they can't experience the horror of what they become doesn't free me from my terrible burden. I am, in part, responsible for this nightmare that surrounds me. In spite of the guilt that is burned into my very being, that will haunt my every breath, I might have tried to survive if only to see you again. But my best efforts only delay the inevitable. I am infected, and there is no cure for what will follow, except to end my life before I lose the only thing that separates me from them. My love for you. Please understand. Please know that I'm sorry. Martin Crackhorn. Jill sighed, laying the crumpled paper gently on the desk. The creatures were victims of their own research. It seemed she'd had the right idea about what had happened in the mansion. The reading the heartfelt letter put a serious damper on any pride she might have taken from her deduction skills. After placing the Suncrest, she decided that the upstairs office merited a closer look, and with a little digging, she had found the final scrawled testament of Crackhorn tucked in a drawer.
Crackhorn, Martin Crackhorn. That was one of the names on Trent's list.
Jill frowned, walking slowly back to the office door. For some reason, Trent wanted the Stars to figure out what had happened at the mansion before anyone else did. But with as much as he obviously knew about it, why not just tell them outright? And what did he stand to gain by telling them anything at all? She stepped through the office's small foyer and back out into the hall, still frowning. Barry had been acting strange before, and she needed to find out why. Maybe she could get a straight answer if she just asked him outright.
Or maybe not. Either way, it'll tell me something.
Jill stopped by the back stairs, taking a deep breath, and realized that something was different. She looked around uncertainly, trying to figure out what it was her senses were telling her.
It's warmer. Just a little. But it's definitely warmer. And the air isn't quite as stale.
Like someone had opened a window. Or maybe a door. Jill turned and jogged down the stairs, suddenly anxious to check the puzzle lock. Reaching the bottom of the steps, she saw that the door connecting one hall to the next was standing open. She could hear crickets singing faintly, feel the fresh night air wafting towards her through the frigid mustiness of the house. She hurried to the darker corridor and hooked a right, trying not to get her hopes up. Another sharp right, and she could see that the door that led to the covered walkway was standing open.
Maybe that's all it is. Doesn't mean the puzzle's solved.
Jill broke into a run, feeling the clean warmth of the summer air against her skin as she rounded the corner in the stone path, and let out a short, triumphant laugh as she saw the 4 placed crests next to the open door. A warm breeze was flowing through the room that the puzzle had unlocked, a small storage shed for gardening tools. The metal door on the wall opposite was standing open. Jill could see moonlight playing across the brick wall just past the rusted hinges. Barry had been right. The door led outside. They'd be able to get help now, find a safe route through the woods, or at least signal.
But if Barry found the missing pieces, why didn't he come looking for me?
Jill's grin faded as she stepped into the shed, absently taking in the dusty boxes and barrels that lined the gray stone walls. Barry had known where she was, had suggested himself that she take the second floor of the west wing.
So maybe it wasn't Barry who opened the door.
True, it could have been Chris or Wesker or one of the Bravos. If that was the case, she should probably go back in and look for Barry.
Or investigate a little first. Make sure it's worth the effort.
It was a bit of a rationalization, but she had to admit to herself that the thought of returning to the mansion with a possible escape in front of her wasn't all that enticing. She unholstered her Beretta and walked towards the outer door, her decision made. The first thing she noticed was the sound of rushing water over the soft forest noises that filled the cooling air like a waterfall. The second and third were the bodies of the 2 dogs that lay across the irregular stone path, shot to death.
Pretty safe bet that one of the stars came this way.
Jill edged out into a high-walled courtyard, low hedges set into brick planters on either side. Dark clouds hung oppressively low overhead. Across the open space was a barred iron gate just past an island of shrubs. To her left, a straight path overshadowed by the 10-foot-high brick walls that bordered it. The gentle waterfall sound seemed to come from that direction, though the path ended abruptly in a metal gate a few feet high.
Stairs going down, maybe?
Jill hesitated, looked back at the arched, rusty gate in front of her, then at the curled bodies of the mutant dogs. They were both closer to the gate than the walkway, and assuming that they'd been killed while attacking, the shooter would have been headed in that direction. There was a sudden sound of water splashing wildly, making the decision for her. Jill turned and ran down the moonlit walk, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. She reached the end of the stone path and leaned over the gate, then drew back a little, surprised by the sudden drop-off. There were no stairs. The gate opened to a tiny platform elevator and a huge open courtyard 20 feet below. The splashing was off to the right, and Jill looked down and across the wide yard just in time to see a shadowy figure walk through the waterfall she'd heard, disappearing behind the curtain of water that cascaded down the west wall.
What the hell?
She stared at the small waterfall, blinking, not sure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. Splashing had stopped as soon as the person disappeared. She was fairly certain that she wasn't hearing things, which meant that the rushing water concealed a secret passage.
Great. Just what this place needs. Lord knows I didn't get enough of that inside.
Controls for the one-man lift were on a metal bar next to the rusting gate. The platform itself down in the courtyard. Jill toggled the power switch, but nothing happened. She'd have to get down another way, wasting time while the mysterious splasher got away.
Unless...
Jill looked down the narrow elevator shaft. An inset square only 3 feet across and open on the side facing the yard. Coming up would be a bitch, but descending? Cake. She could crouch her way down in a minute or less, using her back and legs to support her weight. As she unstrapped the shotgun from her back in preparation for the climb, a disturbing thought occurred to her. If the person who'd gone through the waterfall was one of the stars, How had they known that the passage was even there? Good question, and not one she wanted to linger over. Holding the shotgun tightly, Jill pushed the gate open and carefully started down the shaft. They'd given Barry a full 15 minutes before heading through the winding halls of the West Wing and finding the open back door. They stood there now, looking at the slab of copper and its 4 engraved crests. Chris stared at the crescent moon that Barry had taken, feeling confused and more than a little worried. Barry was one of the most honest, straightforward guys that he had ever known. He said that he was going to look for Jill and then come back for them, and that's what he meant to do. But he didn't come back. And if he ran into trouble, how did the piece I gave him end up here? He didn't like any of the explanations his mind was giving him to work with. Someone could have taken it from him, could have placed it in himself and then been injured somehow. The possibilities seemed endless, and none of them good. Sighing, he turned away from the diagram and looked at Rebecca. Whatever happened to Barry, we should go ahead. This may be the only way off the estate. Rebecca smiled a little.
Fine by me. It just feels good to get out of there, you know?
Yeah, no kidding. He hadn't even realized how accustomed he'd grown to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the house until they'd left it. The difference was truly amazing. They walked through the tiny storage room and stopped at the back door, both of them breathing deeply. Rebecca checked her Beretta for about the 100th time since they'd left the main hall, chewing at her lower lip nervously. Chris could see how tightly wound she was and tried to think if there was anything she needed to know. Anything that would help her if they were forced into a combat situation. Star's training covered all the basics, but shooting at a video screen with a toy gun was a far cry from the real thing. He grinned suddenly, remembering the words of wisdom he'd gotten on his first operation, a standoff with a small group of whacked-out survivalists in upstate New York. He'd been terrified and trying desperately not to show it. Captain for the mission had been a tough-as-nails explosives expert, an extremely short woman named Kaler. She'd pulled him aside just before they went in, looked him up and down, and given him the single best piece of advice he'd ever received.
Son, no matter what happens, when the shooting starts, try not to wet your pants.
It had surprised him out of his nervousness. A statement so totally weird that he'd literally been forced to let go of the worst of his fear to make room for it.
What are you grinning about?
Chris shook his head, the smile fading. Somehow he didn't think it would work on Rebecca, and the dangers they faced didn't shoot back. Long story. Come on, let's go. They moved out into the calm night air, crickets and cicadas buzzing sleepily in the surrounding woods. They were in a kind of courtyard, high brick walls on either side, an offshoot walkway to their left. Chris could hear rushing water nearby, the mournful cry of a dog or coyote in the distance, a lonely, faraway sound. Speaking of dogs, there were a couple of them sprawled out across the stones, soft moonlight glistening against their wet, sinewy bodies. Chris edged up to one of them and crouched down, touching its flank. Quickly pulled his hand back, scowling. The mutant dog was sticky and warm, like it had been sheathed in a thick layer of mucus. He stood up, wiping his hand on his pants. Hasn't been dead long. Less than an hour, anyway. There was a rusted iron gate just past some hedges in front of them. Chris nodded at Rebecca, and as they walked towards it, the sound of rushing water increased to a dull roar. Chris pushed at the gate and it swung open on violently squealing hinges, revealing a huge cut stone reservoir easily the size of a couple of swimming pools. Deep shadows draped and hung at every side, caused by the seemingly solid walls of murky green trees and lush vegetation that threatened to break through the bordering rails. They moved forward, stopping at the edge of the massive pool. It was apparently in the slow process of being drained, turbulent noise caused by the narrow flow of water through a raised gate on the east side. There wasn't a complete path around the reservoir, but Chris saw that there was a walkway bisecting the pool itself, about 5 feet below the water level. There were bolted ladders at both sides. The path had obviously been submerged until quite recently, the stones dark with dripping algae. Chris studied the unusual setup for a moment, wondering how anyone got across when it wasn't being drained. Another mystery to add to the growing list. Without speaking, he climbed down and hurried across, boots squelching against the slimy stones, clammy humidity enveloping them. Chris quickly scaled the second ladder, reaching down to help Rebecca up. The heavily shaded path was littered with branches of pine needles and appeared to border the east end of the reservoir, passing over the open floodgate. They started towards the fourth waterfall, and had only gotten a few feet when it started to rain. Chris frowned, an inner voice informing him coolly that he shouldn't be able to hear raindrops over the roar of the draining water. He looked up and saw a twisted branch falling from the stretching foliage hanging over the rail, a branch that hit the stone and slid smoothly away.
That's not a branch.
And there were dozens of them already on the ground, twisting across the stark stone, hissing and writhing as they fell from the trees overhead. He and Rebecca were surrounded by snakes.
Oh, shit.
Startled, Rebecca turned to look at Chris and felt cold terror shoot through her. Her heart squeezed in its icy grip as she took in the path behind them. The ground had come to life, black shapes coiling towards their feet and dropping from above like living rain. Rebecca started to raise her gun, realizing numbly that there were too many even as Chris roughly grabbed her arm.
Run!
They stumbled forward, Rebecca crying out involuntarily as a thick, writhing body fell across her shoulder. Felt the cool scales against her arm as it slid heavily off and hit the stones. The path zigzagged, and they ran through the shifting shadows, heels crunching down on rubbery, moving flesh, throwing them off balance. The snakes started forward to strike at their packing boots as they ran over a steel grate. Flash of foaming water thundering below, the sound of their boots hitting metal washed with a liquid roar. Ahead of them, the stones were clearer. The path also dropped off sharply, a small elevator platform marking its end. There was no place left to go. They crowded onto the tiny platform, and Rebecca snatched at the controls, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Chris turned and fired repeatedly, shots blasting over the crash of water as Rebecca found the operating button and slammed it down. The platform shuddered and started to descend, slipping down past rock walls toward the massive, empty courtyard below. Rebecca turned, raising the Beretta to help Chris, and felt her jaw drop, her throat locking at the gruesome scene. There had to be hundreds of them, the path almost completely hidden by the slithering creatures, hissing and squirming in an alien frenzy as they struck wildly at each other. By the time she managed to unfreeze, the loathsome sight had risen past eye level and was gone. The ride seemed to last forever, both of them staring up at the edge of the path they'd left behind, tensely, breathlessly waiting for the bodies to start falling. When the lift was within a few feet of the bottom, they both jumped off, stumbling quickly away from the wall. They both leaned against a cool rock, gasping. Rebecca took in the courtyard they'd escaped to in between shuddering breaths, letting the sound of the splashing waterfall soothe her nerves. It was a huge, open space made out of brick and stone, the colors washed out and hazy in the frail light. The water from the reservoir above tumbled down into two stone pools nearby, and there was a single gate across from them.
And no thanks.
She took a final deep breath and blew it out, then turned to Chris.
Were you bit?
He shook his head. You?
No. Though if it's all the same to you, I'd rather not go back that way. I'm more of a cat person, really.
Chris stared at her for a moment and then grinned, pushing away from the wall. Funny. I would have figured you for lab rats.
The radio!
Rebecca grabbed at the unit hooked to her belt, the snake suddenly forgotten. It was the sound she'd been hoping to hear ever since they'd found Richard. They were being hailed, maybe by searchers. She thumbed the receiver and held the radio up so they could both hear. Static crackled through the tinny speaker along with the soft whine of a wavering signal.
This is Brad! Alpha Team! Can hear this!
His voice disappeared in a burst of static. Rebecca hit the transmit button and spoke quickly.
Brad? Brad, come in!
The signal was gone. They both listened for a moment longer, but nothing else came through. He must have gotten out of range. He sighed, walking further out into the open yard and gazing up at the dark, overcast sky. Rebecca clipped the silent radio back to her belt, still feeling more hopeful than she had all night. Pilot was out there somewhere, circling around and looking for them. Now that they were clear of the mansion, they'd be able to hear him signal.
Assuming he comes back.
Rebecca ignored the thought and walked over to join Chris, who had found another tiny elevator platform tucked in the corner across from the waterfall. Quick check showed it to be without power. Chris turned towards the gate, slapping a fresh clip into his Beretta. Shall we see what's behind door number 1? It was a rhetorical question. Unless they wanted to go back through the snakes, It was their only option. Just the same, Rebecca smiled and nodded, wanting to make sure he knew she was ready, and hoping desperately that if anything else happened, she would be. Chapter 14. Jill stood at the edge of a yawning open pit in the dark tunnel, staring helplessly at the door on the other side. The pit was too wide to safely jump, and there were no other way to climb down, at least not that she could see. She'd have to go back and try the door by the ladder. Her frustrated sigh turned into a shiver. The damp chill emanating from the stone walls would have been bad enough without her being dripping wet.
Great secret passage. To use it, you have to catch pneumonia.
A glint of metal caught her gaze as she turned, feet squelching in her boots. She peered down at it, brushing a wet strand of hair out of her eyes. It was a small iron plate set into the stone, a six-sided hole about the size of a quarter in the center. She looked back at the door thoughtfully.
Maybe it was a bridge or lower stairs?
It didn't matter, since she didn't have whatever tool it required. It was as good as a dead end. Besides, it was unlikely that whoever she'd seen walking through the waterfall had managed to get across. Jill walked back through the twisting passage towards the entrance to the tunnel, still in awe of what she'd found behind the curtain of water. It appeared that there was a whole network of tunnels running beneath the estate. The walls were rough and uneven, chunks of sandy limestone protruding at odd angles. But the sheer amount of work that had gone into creating the underground path was mind-boggling. She reached the metal door next to the ladder, having to make a conscious effort not to let her teeth chatter as a cold draft swept down from the courtyard above. The sound of the waterfall was strangely muted. The steady, echoing rhythm of water dripping to the rock floor was much louder, giving the tunnels a somewhat medieval feel. She pushed the door open and froze, feeling a rush of mixed emotions as Barry Burton whirled around to face her, revolver in hand. Surprise 1. "Barry!" He quickly lowered the weapon, looking as shocked as she felt, and just about as wet, too. His t-shirt clung to his broad shoulders, his short hair plastered to his skull. "Jill, how did you get down here?"
Same way you did, apparently. But how did you know?
He held up his hand, shushing her. "Listen." They stood in tense silence, Jill looking up and down the stone corridor and failing to hear whatever Barry had heard. There were metal doors at either end, casting shadow by the dim utility lights overhead. "I thought I heard something. Voices." Before she could ask any questions, he turned and faced her, smiling uneasily. "Look, I'm sorry I didn't wait for you, but I heard somebody walking out in the garden and had to take a look. I found this place by accident, kind of tripped and fell in. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. Let's check around, see what we can dig up." Jill nodded, but decided to keep a close eye on Barry for a while. Maybe she was paranoid, but in spite of his words, he didn't seem all that happy to see her.
Watch and wait.
For now, there was nothing else she could do. Barry led them towards the door to the right, holding his Colt up. He pulled the handle, revealing another gloomy tunnel. A few steps in to the right was another metal door, and across from it, the passage veered sharply into almost complete darkness. Barry motioned at the door, and Jill nodded. He pushed it open, and the two of them moved into another silent corridor. Jill sighed inwardly as she studied the bare, rocky walls, wishing that she had a piece of chalk with her. The tunnel they were in now looked pretty much like all the rest of them, turning left up ahead. She already felt lost, and hoped that there weren't too many more twists and turns. "Hello? Who's there?" A deep, familiar voice shouted from somewhere ahead of them, the words echoing through the passage.
Enrico?
"Jill? Is that you?"
Excited, Jill ran the last few steps to the corner and around, Barry right behind her. The Bravo team leader was still alive, had somehow ended up down here. Jill rounded the next corner and saw him sitting against a wall, the tunnel widening out and ending in a shadowy alcove.
"Hold it! Stop right there!"
She froze, staring at the Beretta he had pointed at her. He was injured, blood seeping from his leg and puddling on the floor.
"Are you with anyone, Jill?"
His dark eyes were narrowed with suspicion, the black bore of his semi-automatic unwavering.
Barry's here too. Enrico, what happened? What's this about?
As Barry stepped out from behind the corner, Enrico stared at them both for a long moment, his gaze darting back and forth nervously. And then he sagged, lowering his gun as he fell back against the stones. Barry and Jill hurried over, crouching down next to the wounded Bravo.
I'm sorry. I had to make sure.
It was as though defending himself had taken the last bit of strength. Jill took his hand gently, alarmed at how pale he was. Blood oozed from his thigh, his pants soaked with it.
This whole thing was a setup.
He turned his wavering gaze towards her.
I got lost. Climbed the fence, saw the tunnels. Found the paper. Umbrella knew all along.
Barry looked stricken, his face almost as white as Enrico's.
Hang on, Rico. We'll get you out of here. You just have to lie still.
Enrico shook his head, still looking at Jill.
There's a traitor in the stars. He told me.
Enrico's body jumped as two holes suddenly appeared in his chest, blood pulsing out of them in violent spurts. Through the resounding echo of the shots, running footsteps clattered away down the corridor behind them. Barry launched to his feet and sprinted around the corner as Jill helplessly squeezed Enrico's twitching hand, her heart pounding and sick. He slumped over, dead before he touched the cold stone floor. Her mind flooded with questions as Barry's pursuing footsteps faded away, silence settling once again over the deep shadows. What paper had the Bravo found? When Enrico had said traitor, she'd immediately thought of Barry acting so strangely. But he'd been right beside her when the shots had been fired.
So who did this? Who was Trent talking about? Who did Enrico see?
Feeling lost and alone, Jill held his cooling hand and waited for Barry to come back. Rebecca was going through an old trunk pushed against one wall of the room they'd entered, shuffling through stacks of papers and frowning while Chris checked out the rest of the room. A single rumpled cot, a desk, and a towering ancient bookshelf were the only other pieces of furniture. After the cold, alien splendor of the mansion, Chris was absurdly grateful to be in simpler surroundings. They'd come to a house at the end of a long, winding path from the courtyard, much smaller and infinitely less intimidating than the mansion. The hall they'd stepped into was plain, undecorated wood, as were the two small bedrooms they'd discovered just off the silent corridor. Chris figured they'd found a bunkhouse for some of the mansion's employees. He had noticed the thick, unmarked dusk in the hallway on their way in with a sinking resignation, realizing that none of the other stars had made it out of the main house. With no way for him and Rebecca to get back, all they could do was try to find the back door and go for help. Chris didn't like it, but there weren't any other options. After a brief perusal of the shelves, Chris walked to the battered wooden desk and pulled at the top drawer. It was locked. He bent down and felt along the bottom of the drawer, grinning as his fingers touched the thick piece of tape.
Don't people ever watch movies? The key's always stuck under the drawer.
He peeled the tape away and came up with a tiny silver key. Still grinning, he unlocked the drawer and pulled it open. There was a deck of playing cards, a few pens and pencils, gum wrappers, and a crumpled pack of cigarettes. Junk, mostly. The kind of stuff that always seemed to accumulate in desk drawers.
Bingo!
Chris picked up the key ring by its leather tag, pleased with himself. If finding the exit was this easy, they'd be on their way back to Raccoon in no time.
Looks like we just got a break.
The leather tag had the word alias burned into one side, the number 345 written on the back in smudged ballpoint pen. Chris didn't know the significance of the number, but he remembered the nickname from the diary he'd found in the mansion.
Thank you, Mr. Alias.
Assuming the keys were for the bunkhouse, they were that much closer to getting off the estate. Rebecca was still sitting by the trunk, surrounded by papers, envelopes, even a few grainy photos that she'd pulled out. She seemed totally absorbed in whatever she was reading, and when Chris walked over to join her, she looked up at him with eyes clouded with worry.
You find something?
Rebecca held up the piece of paper she was reading.
Couple of things. Listen to this. 4 days since the accident, and the plant at Point 42 is still growing and mutating at an incredible rate.
She skipped ahead, skimming the page with one finger as she spoke.
It calls this thing Plant 42, and says its root is in the basement. Here. Shortly after the accident, one of the infected members of the research team became violent and broke the water tank in the basement, flooding the entire section. We think some trace chemicals used in the T-virus tests contaminated the water and contributed to Plant 42's radical mutations. A number of chutes have already been traced to different parts of the building, but the main plant now hangs from the ceiling in the large conference room on the first floor. We've determined that Plant 42 has become sensitive to movement and is now carnivorous. In close proximity to humans, it uses tentacular, prehensile vines to entrap its prey, while leech-like adaptations latch onto exposed skin and draw fatal quantities of blood. Several members of the staff have already fallen victim to this. It's dated May 21st. Signed, Henry Sarton.
Chris shook his head, wondering again how someone could invent a virus like the one they had come across. It seemed to infect everything it touched with madness, transforming its carrier into a deadly carnivore hungry for blood. God, now a man-eating plant. Ugh. Chris shuddered, suddenly twice as glad that they'd be leaving soon. So it infects plants too. When we report this, we'll have to...
No, that's not it.
She handed him a photo, her expression grim. It was a blurry snapshot of a middle-aged man wearing a lab coat. He was standing stiffly in front of a plain wooden door. Chris realized that it was the very door they'd come through not 10 minutes ago, the front entrance to the bunkhouse. He flipped the picture over, squinting at the tiny script on the back. H. Sarton, January 98, .42. He stared at Rebecca, finally understanding her fearful gaze. They were standing in .42. The carnivorous plant was here. Wesker stood in the darkness of the unlit tunnel, his irritation growing as he listened to Barry stumble through the echoing corridors. Jill wouldn't wait forever, and the raging Mr. Burton couldn't seem to grasp that Enrico's killer had simply slid into the shadows just around the corner, the most obvious place there was. Come on. Since they'd left the house, he finally started to feel like things were going in his favor. He'd remembered the underground room near the entrance to the labs, and was almost certain that the wolf metal would be there. And the tunnels were clear. He had expected the 121s to be out, but apparently no one had messed with the passage mechanism since the accident. They'd split up to search for the lever that worked the passages, and it had been in plain sight, propped next to the very mechanism that it controlled. Everything would have been perfect, except goddamned Enrico Marini had wandered along, happening across a very important paper that Wesker had accidentally dropped, his order straight from the head of White Umbrella. And then, to complicate matters, Gil had blundered into the tunnels before Wesker could finish taking care of the problem. Wesker sighed inwardly. If it wasn't one thing, it was another. In truth, this whole affair had been a massive headache from the beginning. At least the underground security hadn't been activated, though he'd had no way of knowing that until they reached the tunnels, and having dragged Barry along his insurance, he now had to deal with the consequences. If the money wasn't so good, he grinned. Who was he kidding? The money was great. After what felt like years, Barry huffed into the dark room, blindly waving his revolver around. Wesker tensed, waiting for him to walk past the generator's alcove. This part could be tricky. Barry and Enrico had been close. As Barry stormed past the small chamber, Wesker stepped out behind him and jammed the muzzle of his Beretta into Barry's lower back, hard. At the same time, he started talking, low and fast. I know you want to kill me, Barry, but I want you to think about what you're doing. I die, your family dies, and right now, looks like Jill may have to die too. But you can stop it. You can put a stop to all the killing. Barry had stopped moving as soon as the gun touched him, but Wesker could hear the barely contained rage in his voice, the pure, driving hatred. You killed Enrico! Wesker pushed the gun deeper into his back. Yes, but I didn't want to. Enrico had found some information he shouldn't have. He knew too much. And if he told Jill what he knew about Umbrella, I'd have to kill her too. You're going to kill her anyway. You're going to kill all of us. That's not true. Don't you get it? I just want to get to the laboratory and get rid of the evidence before anyone finds it. Once that material is destroyed, there's no reason for anyone else to get hurt.
we can all just walk away.
Barry was silent. Wesker could tell that he wanted to believe him, wanted desperately to believe that things could be that simple. Wesker let him waver for a moment before pressing on.
All I want you to do is keep Jill busy. Keep her and anyone else you run into away from the labs, at least for a little while. You'll be saving her life, and I swear to you that as soon as I get what I need, you and your family will never hear from me again.
He waited, and when Barry finally spoke, Wesker knew he had him.
Where are the labs? Good boy.
Wesker lowered the gun, keeping his expression blank just in case Barry had good night vision. He pulled a fold of paper out of his vest and slipped into Barry's hand, a map from the tunnels to the first basement level.
If for some reason you can't keep her away, at least go with her. There are a lot of doors with locks on the outside down there. Worst comes to worst, you can lock her up till it's over. I mean it, Barry. No one else has to get hurt. It's all up to you.
Wesker stepped back quickly, reaching for the lever with the six-sided tip that he'd left next to the generator. He watched Barry for a few seconds longer, saw the sag in the big man's shoulders, the submissive hang of his head. Satisfied, Wesker turned and walked out of the room. On the very slight chance that any of the stars made it to the lab, Mr. Burton would ensure that there wouldn't be any more trouble. He hurried back through the entrance tunnel, silently congratulating himself on getting things back under control as he headed towards the first passage mechanism. He'd have to move fast from here on out. There were a few things he neglected to mention to Barry, like the experimental security detachment that would be released into the tunnels once he turned that lever for the first time.
Sorry, Barry. Slipped my mind.
It would be interesting to see how his team fared with the 1-2-1s, the Hunters. Watching the stars pit their strength and agility against the creatures would be quite a show, and sadly, one that he'd have to miss. It was too bad, really. The Hunters had been caged for a long time. They'd be very, very hungry. Chapter 15. Barry had been gone for too long. Jill had no idea how extensive the tunnels were, but from what they'd seen, they all looked alike. Barry could be lost, trying to find his way back. Or he could have found the murderer, and without any backup, he might not come back at all. In any case, staying put wasn't going to help anything. She stood up, taking a last look at the Bravo's pale face and silently wishing him peace before walking away. What did he find out that got him killed? Who was it? Enrico had only managed to get out that the traitor was a he, but that didn't exactly narrow things down. Except for herself and the rookie, the Raccoon Stars were all male. She could rule out Chris, since he'd been convinced from the start that there was something weird going on. Now Barry, who'd been with her when Marini had died. Brad Vickers simply wasn't the type to do anything dangerous, and Joseph and Kenneth were dead. Which leaves Richard Aiken, Forrest Speyer, and Albert Lester. None of them seemed likely, but she had to at least consider the possibility. Enrico was dead. She no longer doubted that Umbrella had one of the stars in their pocket. When she got to the door, she quickly leaned down and tightened her damp bootlaces, preparing herself. Whoever had shot the Bravo could have just as easily taken her and Barry out. Since he hadn't, she could only figure that he didn't want to kill anyone else and wouldn't be looking for more targets. Assuming that he was still in the underground system, she'd have to be as quiet as possible if she wanted to find him. The tunnels were perfect sound conductors, amplifying even the tiniest sound. She eased open the metal door, listening, then edged out into the dim tunnel, staying close to the wall. In front of her, the corridor was unlit. She opted to head back the way she'd come instead. The darkness was a perfect spot for an ambush. She didn't want to find out she was wrong about the killer's intentions by taking a bullet. A low, grinding rumble reverberated through the heavy stone walls, sounding like something big moving. Jill instinctively used the sound as cover, taking several sliding steps forward and reaching the next metal door just as the rumbling stopped. She slipped back out into the tunnel where she'd run into Barry, gently closing the door behind her. What the hell was that? Sounded like an entire wall moving. She shuddered, remembering the descending ceiling of that room in the house. Maybe the tunnels were rigged too. She needed to watch every step. The idea of being crunched to death by some bizarre mechanism underground, like the one next to that pit, with the hexagonal hole. She nodded slowly, deciding that she needed to go take another look at those doors she couldn't get to before. Maybe the killer had the tool it required, and the noise she'd heard had come from him operating it. She could be wrong, but there was no harm in checking. At least I won't get lost. She reached for the door that would lead her back, and stopped, her head cocked to catch a strange sound coming from the tunnel behind her. It was a rusty hinge? Some kind of a bird, maybe? It was loud, whatever it was. That sound she knew. Footsteps, headed in her direction, and it was either Barry or someone built like him. They were heavy, plodding, but too far apart, too deliberate. Get out of here, now! Jill grabbed at the metal latch and ran into the next tunnel, no longer caring how much noise she made. Although she sometimes misread them, her instincts were never wrong, and they were telling her that whoever or whatever was making that sound, she didn't want to be there when it showed up. She took several running steps down the stone corridor away from the ladder that led back to the courtyard, and then forced herself to slow down, taking a deep breath. She couldn't just go sprinting ahead, either. There were other dangers than the one she'd left behind her. The door opened. Jill turned, raising her Beretta, and stared in horror at the thing standing there. It was huge, shaped like a man, but the resemblance stopped there. Naked but sexless, its entire muscular body was covered with a pebbled, amphibious skin, shaded a dark green. It was hunched over, so that its impossibly long arms almost touched the floor, both of its hands and feet tipped with thick, brutal claws. Tiny, light-colored eyes peered out at her from a flat reptilian skull. It turned its strange gaze towards her, dropped its wide-hinged jaw, and let out a tremendous, high-pitched screech like nothing she'd ever heard before, the sound echoing around her, filling her with mortal terror. Jill fired 3 shots that smacked into the creature's chest and sent it reeling backwards. It stumbled, fell against the tunnel wall, and with another terrible shriek, it sprang at her, pushing off the stones with powerful legs, its claws outstretched and grasping. She fired again and again as it flew towards her, the bullets tearing into its puckered flesh, ribbons of dark blood coiling away, and it landed in a heavy crouch only a few feet in front of her, screaming, one massive arm snaking out to swipe at her legs. A musky, moldy animal smell washed over her, smelled like dark places in feral rage. Jesus, why won't it die? Jill trained the Beretta on the back of its skull and emptied the clip. Even as the green flesh splattered away and bones splintered, she continued to fire, the hot slugs ripping into the pulpy, pinkish mass of its brain. No more bullets. She lowered the weapon, her entire body shaking. It was over. The creature was dead. But it had taken almost an entire clip, 15 9mm rounds, the last 7 or 8 at close range. Still staring at the fallen monster, she ejected the empty magazine and loaded a fresh clip before holstering the Beretta. She reached back and unstrapped the Remington, taking comfort in the solid, balanced weight of the shotgun. What the hell were you people working on out here? It seemed that the Umbrella researchers had invented more than just a virus. Something just as deadly, but with claws. And there could be more of them. She'd never had a more horrifying thought. Holding the Remington close, Jill turned and ran. Chris and Rebecca walked down a long wooden hallway, warily glancing up with every other step. There was what looked like dried, dead ivy poking out of every crack and crevice where the walls met the ceiling, the bone-colored growth that scaled across the planks like a fungus. It looked harmless, but after what Rebecca had read to him about Plant 42, Chris kept himself ready to move quickly. After going through the rest of the papers in the trunk, Rebecca had come up with a report on some kind of an herbicide that could apparently be mixed in Point 42 called V-Jolt. She'd brought it along, but Chris doubted it would be useful. All he wanted was to find the exit. If they could avoid the killer plant, so much the better. The front hall had been clear of the growth, though Chris wasn't prepared to call it secured. Besides the 2 bedrooms by the front door, there had been a rec room that had been distinctly creepy. Chris had looked inside and immediately felt his internal alarms going off, though he hadn't known why. There had been no danger that he could see, just a bar and a couple of tables. In spite of the seeming calm, he had closed the door quickly and they'd moved on. His gut feeling was enough of a reason to leave it alone. They stopped in front of the only door in the long, meandering stretch of hallway, both of them still glancing nervously at the scaling ivy near the ceiling. Chris pushed at the knob, and the door swung open. Warm, humid air flooded out of the shadowy room, thick and tropical, but with a nasty undertone, like the taint of spoiled fruit. Chris instinctively pushed Rebecca behind him as he saw the walls of the chamber. They were completely covered in the same kind of strange, straggling growth that was in the hall. But here, the scaling ivy was lush and bloated, a bilious verdant green. There was a faint whispering coming from inside the room, a subtle sense of movement, and Chris realized that it was coming from the sickly plant matter itself, the walls quivering in a weird optical illusion as the draping tendrils crept and grew. Rebecca started to step past him, and Chris pushed her back. "What are you, nuts? I thought you said this thing sucks blood." She shook her head, staring at the whispering walls.
That's not Plant 42, at least not the part the report talked about. Plant 42 is going to be a lot bigger and a lot more mobile. I never did much with phytobiology, but according to that study, we'll be looking for an angiosperm with motile foliage.
She smiled a quick, nervous smile.
Sorry. Think a great big plant bulb with 10 to 20 foot vines waving around it.
Chris grimaced. Great. Thanks for putting my mind at rest. They edged into the large room, careful not to walk too closely to the hissing walls. There were 3 doors besides the one that they came through. One directly across from the entrance, and the other 2 facing each other to their left where the room opened up. Chris led them towards the door opposite the entrance, figuring it as the most likely to lead out of the bunkhouse. The door was unlocked. Chris started to push it open. The door slammed shut, causing them both to jump back, weapons raised. A series of heavy, sliding thumps followed, like someone on the other side was kicking at the walls. Except the sounds were everywhere, above and below the door's sturdy frame, beating against every corner of the sealed room. Lots of vines, you said. Rebecca nodded.
I think we found Plant 42.
They listened for a moment, Chris thinking about the kind of strength and weight it would take to slam the door so solidly. No kidding. Bigger and more mobile. Maybe blocking the only entrance to this place. Terrific. They backed away, turning into the open area and looking at the other 2 doors. The one on their right had the number 002 above it. Chris fished out the keys he'd found and flipped through them, finding one with a matching number. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, Rebecca behind him. There was a smaller door to the left that opened to a bathroom, quiet and dusty. The room itself was another bedroom, a bunk, a desk, a couple of shelves, nothing of interest. There was another series of dull thumps from behind the far wall, and they quickly moved back into the humid, whispering room, Chris fighting a growing certainty that they were going to have to deal with the plan if they wanted to get out. Not necessarily. There could still be another way. The way things had been going so far, he didn't think so. From the shuffling zombies lurking in the main house, to the run through the courtyard, snakes dropping from the trees, every part of the Spencer estate seemed to be designed to keep them from leaving. Chris shook the negative thoughts aside as they approached the shadowy chamber's final door. But they came rushing back at the sight of the small green keypad set next to the frame. He rattled the knob, but there was no give. It was another dead end. Security lock. No way to get in without the code. Rebecca frowned down at the tiny pattern of red light set above the numbered buttons.
We could just try numbers until we run across the right combination.
Chris shook his head. You know what our chances are of just stumbling across the right... He stopped, staring at her, and fumbled the keyring out of his pocket. Try 345. He watched eagerly as Rebecca dutifully punched in the number. Come on, Mr. Alias, don't fail us now. Pattern of red lights flashed, then blinked out one by one. As the last tiny light faded, there was a click from inside the door. Chris grinned, pushing the door open, and felt his hope dwindle as he glanced around the tiny room. Dusty shelves filled with tiny glass bottles, and a rust-stained sink. Not the exit he'd expected.
No, that would have been too easy. God knows we can't have that.
Rebecca walked quickly to one of the shelves and looked over at the glass bottles, mumbling to herself.
Halcyon, anhydride, dieldrin.
She turned back to him, grinning widely.
Chris, we can kill the plant! That Vigil, the phytotoxin, I can make it here! If we can get to the basement, find the plant's root.
Chris smiled back. Then we can destroy it without having to fight the damn thing. Rebecca, you're brilliant. How long do you need?
10, 15 minutes.
You got it. Stay here. I'll be back as soon as I can. Rebecca was already pulling down bottles as Chris closed the door and jogged back towards the corridor, past the whispering walls of shadowy green. They were going to beat this place. And once they got out, Umbrella was going down hard. Barry was standing over Enrico's cold body, Wesker's map crumpled in one hand. Jill had been gone when he'd returned, and rather than look for her, he'd found himself unable to move, to even tear his gaze away from the corpse of his murdered friend.
It's my fault. If I hadn't helped Wesker get out of the house, you'd still be alive.
Barry stared miserably at Enrico's face, so filled with guilt and shame that he didn't know what to do anymore. He knew he had to find Jill, keep her from getting to Wesker, keep his family from being hurt. But still, he couldn't seem to force himself to walk away. What he wanted more than anything was to be able to explain himself to Enrico. Make him understand how things had come to be the way they were.
He's got Kathy and the babies, Rico. What else could I have done? What can I do but follow his orders?
The Bravo stared back at him with glazed, unseeing eyes. No accusation. No acceptance. No nothing. Forever. Even if Barry continued to help the captain and everything else turned out the way it was supposed to, Rico Marini would still be dead. And Barry didn't know how he was going to live with the knowledge that he was responsible. Shots echoed through the tunnel. A lot of them. Jill! Barry's head snapped around. He reached for his weapon automatically, the sound spurring him to action as anger flushed through his system. There could only be one explanation. Wesker had found Jill. Barry turned and ran, sick at the thought of another STARS member dead by Wesker's treacherous hand, furious with himself for believing the captain's lies. The door in front of him slammed open, and Barry stopped dead in his tracks. All thoughts of Wesker and Jill and Enrico wiped away at the sight of the crouching thing in front of him. His mind couldn't grasp what he saw, stunned gaze feeding him bits of information that didn't make sense. Green skin, piercing orange-white eyes, talons. It screamed, a horrible squealing cry, and Barry didn't think anymore. He squeezed the trigger and the shriek turned into a bubbling, choking gasp as the heavy round tore into his throat and knocked it down. The thing flailed its limbs wildly as blood spurted from the smoking hole. Barry heard several sharp cracks like breaking bones, saw more blood pour from its fists as long, thick claws snapped off against rock. Barry stared in mute astonishment as the creature continued to spasm violently, burbling through the ragged hole in its throat as if still trying to scream. The shot should have blown its head off its neck, but it was another full minute before it died. Its frenzied thrashings gradually weakening as blood continued to pump out at a tremendous rate. Finally, it stopped moving, and from the dark, noxious lake it had created, Barry realized that it had bled to death, conscious until the end. What did I just kill? What the fuck? From the tunnel outside, another shrieking howl resounded through the clammy air, and was joined by a second, then a third. The animal cries rose up, furious and unnatural, screams of creatures that shouldn't exist. Barry dug into his hip pack with shaking hands and pulled out more rounds for the Colt, praying to God that he had enough, and that those shots he'd heard before hadn't been Jill's last stand.